By profession, a misanthropologist and deviantiquarian. By trade, a lecturer in classical and medieval studies at Laurentian University, and possibly their tallest. Allan has his BA in anthropology from Laurentian, where he specialized in archaeology, his MA from Bradford University, again in anthropology and archaeology, where he studied under the demented tutelage of Professor Tim Taylor, who is actually listed in the UK as an expert on ritual killing and human sacrifice. Allan's official specialty is palaeometallurgy, but he also takes time to pursue studies in mythology, ethno and paleopharmacopoeia, military history, Deviantiquity, and finer workmanship in pipes. Allan is currently exploring the nature and status of metalworking within the Roman world and trying to figure out what two men who died 2,000 years ago did for a living. He's ever preparing to systematically corrupt a new generation of students and can't believe they're paying him to lecture on the archaeology of conflict in the classical world. Life is good. Ladies and gentlemen, Allan Daoust.
Thank you for that. Believe it or not, I've actually figured out what those two men who died 2,000 years ago did for a living. So I guess my life needs a new purpose now. When I was asked by a friend of mine to present this evening, I wasn't entirely sure where to focus the discourse on for this evening. And so I did a fair bit of digging and perusing around, mostly of skeptical blogs and atheist websites and the like, to get some sort of inspiration. And fortunately, it hit me rather quickly. Apparently, there's a great deal of emphasis on science within the wider wider skeptical and atheist community. And while most recently, I've been studying archaeometallurgy and have a great deal of interest in science. Sometimes science is the wrong tool to get the message across. I've noticed there's a great obsession almost with discussing and debating the minutiae of evolutionary theory with creationists. And to some extent, it's sort of like trying to teach interior design to a warthog. Even if you do get it across, you're just going to get mud on everything and destroy it in the end anyways. And so sometimes science is the wrong tool. And that gave me the focus for what I'm going to talk about tonight, which is my particular interest in social science, particularly archaeology, and to an equal but slightly lesser extent occasionally, anthropology. So for my discussion this evening, I'm going to focus on two main points, largely from a social science perspective, primarily anthropology and archaeology. The first of which is a discussion of eschatologies, what they are, what their purpose is, and why people believe in them, even to this day. And then I'm going to expand upon that idea of why some eschatologies are believed and the impact that that has on popular discourse amongst the 21st century. So to begin with, what are eschatologies? They're generally summarized as destruction narratives, as end myths. But that definition itself is loaded with a variety of terms that are themselves in need of subsequent definition, one of the most problematic being myth. Myth is a common term that's used regularly in popular parlance. The problem is it has so many definitions that the precise meaning is often lost, particularly the more academic or refined meaning. Myth has gone through a great process of vulgarization because of its frequent and regular use. Now, as a myth, eschatologies represent culturally, relevant narratives. Myths themselves are narratives or stories that are important in some way to a culture in question. They're often believed to be true by the culture which provides those myths, but then subsequently believed to be untrue by other cultures. Most people no longer believe in the Trojan War, the narratives of Zeus and his numerous and rather interesting affairs, or the exploits of the Norse gods. But all of those narratives were believed by their parent cultures at some level. But more importantly, those narratives had some meaning for those people. They indicated something significant and something important about their society, and perhaps most importantly, their culture. Eschatologies are a very particular form of such narratives. They're important for the cultures that develop them in a number of different ways. They serve specific functions in the societies that produce them. But the problem for eschatologies is that they're only part of the story. They represent only one half of the wider narrative. And generally, these end narratives or destruction narratives are told in isolation, and so we lose a wider context and any sort of wider understanding of their meaning and significance. Eschatologies are closely married to creation narratives. They form the second half of the creation story. The world is created, and then it is destroyed, and then the second half of the eschatology narrative, it is recreated or reborn. Now, creation myths tend to represent a form of myth known as the charter myth, which basically sets up the current state of affairs. Cultures that were providing these narratives were well aware of the current state of affairs. They were well aware of their own reality and the realities of human existence, that the world is unfair, there is evil, there is suffering, bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. And so they've set up creation myths to explain that reality, to provide a cause or an impetus behind that injustice, imbalance, and randomness within the world. But oftentimes, that wasn't enough for exploring the intricacies and depth of human culture and society. And so there is a continuation of the narrative, a form of thought experiment, if you will, in the form of eschatologies. By destroying the world as it existed, as it was created, this imperfect world, it allowed cultures to explore the significant elements of their own society, their particular values, what separated them from other cultures and other peoples, what basically made them human. Basically, eschatologies were good to think with. They were self-reflective stories on a cultural level. And this is why they vary so greatly, even though they tend to consist of common themes, generally a wiping of the slate, as it were. This also allowed cultures to explore philosophical possibilities, to explore a world without suffering, a world that wasn't flawed from the very outset, from the very beginning, to explore a world that was different from the one in which those individuals had inherited. And so eschatologies, when separated from the creation narrative and when focusing solely upon the destruction narrative, miss their wider context. They miss their wider purpose and function. And they often miss the second half, the rebirth, the cultural thought experiment, perhaps the most crucial component of eschatologies. Now, because these eschatologies were thought experiments and were used by societies to explore possibilities, to produce experiments that simply could not be produced in the real world, they're closely tied to culture, and they're closely tied to societies at a very specific point in their history and in their development. And so without that context, eschatologies are interesting myth narratives. They provide a bit of humor and a bit of entertainment, but separated from that cultural context, they lose their wider meaning and their wider significance. And yet we find, time and again, individuals or groups of individuals subscribing to or believing in the eschatologies of cultures other than their own. And that brings me to what will be the second point, perhaps the one that I'm most passionate about. And that is this separation of the narrative from its cultural context and the removal of its wider significance from eschatologies. Basically, why are some eschatologies believed over others? And why are we obsessing about this Mayan apocalypse as opposed to Ragnarok, for instance? It could get close to the Fimbulwinter here.
Every winter.
Well, yes. And the reasoning behind this is tied to some extent, an incomplete understanding of the social sciences and particularly archaeology and its perhaps parent field, depending on where you're from, anthropology. And it's tied to the most recent bane of archaeologists and anybody teaching myth or related fields, ancient aliens. The popularity of that show simply boggles my mind. And it's representative and indicative of a wider problem. While I fully agree with the wider skeptic and atheist community that education within the sciences is of absolute importance to battle superstition and delusional beliefs and their detrimental effects upon society as a whole, it is perhaps equally important to emphasize education within the social sciences in order to combat ancient aliens. It seems that the eschatologies that are subscribed to currently, such as the Mayan apocalypse, are tied to those cultures which have provided technological marvels or produced works that were considered impossible for humans to accomplish. And there seems to be a cycle, particularly with ancient aliens, of cherry-picking cultures throughout the world, throughout different time periods, in different contexts, as representative of those marvels, of some sort of supernatural intervention, whether it be extraterrestrial or divine. And the main problem that is caused by is this wider lack of understanding of past technological capabilities, of the technological foundations upon which human societies and cultures are ultimately built. It's been about 4 generations since the invention of the diesel engine. And in that time, we've lost a connection to the production of our technology with our own hands. And so we find on shows such as Ancient Aliens, these large-scale construction projects, any bit of work that is complicated that would require us to use power tools or modern technology to produce is simply labeled as impossible for the culture in question. And it seems numerous people subscribe to that thought, to that belief, if you will. And I feel that this is largely the product of a lack of education in archaeology and its wider subdisciplines. This narrative lends false credibility to their wider mythical narratives that are ascribed to the cultures in question, who produce technological works that are considered to be impossible without some sort of supernatural intervention. And that then lends credibility to the stories and narratives that they've provided. It then lends some sense of authenticity to their mythical narrative and leads to belief in this particular case, their eschatologies. For instance, the Mayan eschatology that is apparently set right before Christmas. The best way to combat this is through an increased archaeological or technological education by advancing our understanding of the technological capacities of past cultures, of their capability of producing things with what they had at hand, without the use of power tools, electricity, diamond-tipped cutting tools, and so on. Certainly this reflects the same sort of skepticism that is found amongst the wider scientific community. And to a greater extent, it is connected to the same narrative. Social sciences being merely the science of society, and if extended further, of human culture and human civilization. And so these mythical narratives, these eschatologies, reflect a wider human reality, a deeper interest in where we've come from and where we could go when explored in their own proper context, when separated from these wider mythical or supernatural narratives, when they've been extracted from the mythical and they've been removed from any wider supernatural narrative. Collectively, they show us that humans have always been interested in where they come from and where they could possibly end up. They show a continued fear of the future, of what is coming around the bend, of the fragility of society and our cultural institutions, and the frayed threads that hold that society together. Collectively, the eschatologies of the ancient world are tied to their divine beliefs, their religious foundations, whereas ours are tied closely to our current cultural narrative, things like the zombie apocalypse, for instance, or the destruction by some natural disaster, usually an impact of some sort. Those narratives focus on exactly the same elements that past eschatologies focused on. only with the removal of the divine element. And they demonstrate the same concern about the fragility of society, the Lord of the Flies-esque collapse of social institutions and order. All of them represent a collective human fear and paranoia that underlies our reality. And yet, as has been demonstrated time and again throughout human history, fear and paranoia are always combated at some level by education and wider understanding. And so, hopefully some of the discourse that will follow over the course of this weekend will illuminate and shed light on some of those fears and demonstrate that these mythical narratives don't necessarily need to have a supernatural component or element. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for listening to me rant for this period and allow everyone to get back to perhaps what is more important this evening, cash bar and pizza. Thank you.
I'd like to ask you, where in your philosophy do you fit fears that aren't quite so irrational, such as worries about global warming or overpopulation?
I mean, effectively, they are the same sorts of fears that eschatologies in the past had dealt with. The outside influence leading to the destruction of society and the fragility of human culture and the institutions that they're built on. So to some extent, I mean, a lot of the past fears that were addressed in eschatologies are really as rational as modern fears surrounding climate change, for instance. The only difference now being that we have a different technological system that is informing it, lending credibility to it. And in the past, all they could do is hope and predict regarding the inevitable change of their society.
So you were describing as one of the definitions of myth that it's typically believed by the culture that it occurs in. But I think that often we have a great deal of distance from the cultures that we're examining through archaeology or through sociology. And for instance, if somebody in the distant future were to look back at our culture and examining our myths, they might come to the conclusion that we genuinely believed in Santa Claus. Because we, every single December, this time of year, a great big portion of our culture performs that myth as though we believe it. We don't admit that there's no Santa Claus because it's more fun if we all just act like there is a Santa Claus. And so to a certain extent, I sometimes wonder whether a lot of these cultures, and when we assume that they genuinely believed in Thor or Odin, that we might be jumping to certain conclusions about the way they performed those myths. And likewise, thinking of eschatology is in the context of thought experiments. I'm wondering about the kind of thought experiments that we perform in our culture, like a post-racial America, or a peak oil, or a singularity. And often when we're talking about these, we don't think of them in terms of genuine prophecies as to where we're going to arrive, although sometimes we do. But most of the time we're imagining them for the context of advancing our discussions rather than genuinely believing them. And so I was wondering whether you could respond to that idea of whether maybe this idea of belief might not necessarily be consistent now that might affect the definitions of both myth and eschatology.
I suppose the main issue is one of again, we could have spent all evening defining the definitions all the way through. But to some extent, in terms of belief, most of the gods in the ancient world, say Zeus, for instance, or Thor, were associated with religious practices at some level and in the culture in question, for instance. Whereas other cultures, competing cultures, would not necessarily be acknowledging the same God. Now, belief in the validity or the reality of that God might not necessarily be practiced, but in the case of the Greeks, Zeus was acknowledged as, at the very least, a symbol or figurehead or something important to the culture. And so in the same way that Santa is in wider Western culture, as it were, acknowledged as a symbol, whereas it doesn't have the same weight in other cultures without the same sort of tradition. Does that address roughly? I mean, you know, in terms of thought experiments, a lot of them seem to be based more on hope, on how they would like things to turn out. Yeah, but the difference to some extent with eschatologies is they don't necessarily arrive at a solution at all. They simply skip over, they go through the destruction process, and then there's simply that expression of the idealized after effects, or the thought experiment, as it were, but the connecting point from A to B is rarely fleshed out in any great detail, as it were.
What I'd like to ask as a question is, you were saying that myths represent the zeitgeist of a culture. So what I'd like to ask is, what are your views on what our myth, predominantly the Judeo-Christian myths, say about our culture?
Well, that itself is what, to some extent, led me to skepticism and atheism in the first place, is that the at least from my own perspective, the wider Judeo-Christian narrative isn't necessarily my cultural representation. It's derived from a small area that is geographically and temporally far removed from my present. And to some extent, it keeps being then reinvented in various contexts. The Christian tradition in Britain is far different from the Deep South, for instance. So there is still that cultural element, but then all of the respective cultures tend to lend some sort of credibility or inherent truth to their own, to the exclusion of others, which is sort of wrapped up in the definition of myth.
I feel rather confused with the answer to the first question about global warming. While you say that global warming is paranoia, it means, it seems to me, not for all, that you are immunizing the utilization of the carbon fuel, causing emission and affecting the environment negatively. And may it be possible that you may create, you may develop, you may invent newer and newer methods to combat this situation, but denial of global warming coming out of the nuclear explosions, nuclear testings, and carbon emissions and all this, I think it is rather a thing of injustice. Please clarify.
Certainly, I did not say paranoia, I said fear. And it's a cultural fear. It is the main concern at the present. That doesn't mean that I'm denying its authenticity at all.
My apologies. I'm a little unwieldy, and this is not a question, it's an answer. Your considering myth, and frankly, I've called that grandma's tales for years. They're just so stories. They're children who ask you, how did this come to be? And if you happen to be a reasonably competent grandmother, you think up something to answer the fear in the child now. It doesn't mean they're truth, but they can be taken as a form of it, because they allow a child to understand what's happening. There was no denial of global warming, but don't you think that a great many people would be more likely to pay attention to it if it were explained to them that Grandmother Spider thinks it's a bad thing and that we should perhaps drive less? Allow me, please, the native peoples, because I'm not one, so I'm not really allowed to speak in that venue. I am accustomed to telling things in just so stories. They help children understand. In theory, we grow up, but some don't. And if they have a just so story and it puts them on the right path, does that really matter?
I was actually thinking of your comment, your earlier comment about paranoia, but you know, I said to myself, well, even paranoids can have real enemies. I think it is very important for us to be alarmed and to do something about things we can do about. And I understand that some fears are real, like the fear of the Vikings and the fear of the Huns was real, and so on. But yeah, I don't want to. There are certain fashionable alarms, worries about certain kinds of people or certain kinds of calamities that may be exaggerated or they may be very, very germane. So I see. You're not denying it, but they did, you know, like raise a question, like, you know, are these? There's just stupid things like aliens, which, you know, to me don't even cover, like, don't even reach my consciousness. And then there are things like global warming and population control, which I've been worrying about for 30 years. So two very different feelings about them.
To a larger extent, I mean, eschatologies are designed to explore the after effects of the destruction and to create a thought experiment society of what would happen if, and then particularly in more recent contexts, as a demonstration of a undesirable or desirable future, depending on the case of the particular narrative. And in that context, serve as a sort of call to action in the way that sort of Lord of the Flies demonstrates the fragility of society amongst children, and could be used as a call to action for increased discipline, for instance. The way that Lucifer's hammer demonstrated the sort of lack of preparedness or human futility when faced with that. And so while global warming fits in with that, we don't necessarily have an eschatological narrative of what the world exactly would look like afterwards to basically scare the heck out of everybody into action. It's the sort of just so story.
I can build you one right now.
I'd like to continue this discussion afterwards over beer and pizza, etc.